Okay, so we are recording, Claude, and I need you to acknowledge that you know that you're being recorded and that this may end up on YouTube. If you could
Yep.
verbally acknowledge that, okay, fantastic. And then I also need you to say and spell your first and last names.
Yep. My first name is Claudius, and that's Claudius. I'm sorry, I'm bad at spelling. And Johnson Perry, JOHNSON-PERRY.
And do you want to be Claudius in the story, or can I call you Claude in the
Oh,
story?
Claude is fine. Yeah.
Okay, I just wanted to verify that. Don't want to stop. And you use he, him pronouns, correct?
Correct. Correct.
Okay. So, how old are you?
I am 28. I turned 29 in like a week.
Well, happy birthday early.
Thank
I
you.
just turned 52, so we are
Nice
both
work.
Aries. So help our readers understand a little bit about your journey to becoming who you are.
Yeah, it's a lot of the you know how they say hindsight is 2020. It's a lot of that because, when I was a kid, there's a lot of stuff I was doing that's like I could look back on that and be like, "Hey, I did always want to be a boy." And I didn't know there were words for it. I came out at 21, I want to say. Um and basically what happened was there was an event that was so dysphoric and uncomfortable for me that it felt unnatural, and I was finally like, okay, I gotta figure out what's going on. And I had been reading online a little bit about what being transgender meant, and I was like, oh, so just it's always this thing where it's like there's people who say, oh well, I know somebody who's transgender, but that can't be me. And I thought that was me. I was like, well, I'm not transgender. I'm just uncomfortable with the idea of being a woman. Yeah. So there were things like my dad used to call me his eldest son. That brought me a lot of joy. I wanted to be the strongest in when they ask you to go pick up the chairs. I would be, mistaken for a boy in high school, and I'd turn around and get really excited, and they'd apologize, and I'd be like, no, 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 continue. It's just a lot of stuff like that.
So you didn't really have sort of that sort of self struggle that we hear a lot about with both trans and LGBT folks. There was more of a sudden realization, it sounds like.
Right. Yeah. And it's more like I don't know if it's that I've been suppressing it. It's very likely. Because that's something I also hear a lot about when people transition or find out older in life in their 20s or whatever. Um, and yeah, I would say that that's something either I didn't know or I was suppressing it. I would agree.
Okay. So when you sort of had this light bulb moment, and that's sort of what I'm imagining here. I apologize
Yeah.
for that, but I have this great image of a light bulb just going off over your head.
Right.
What were your next steps at that point? Because I mean, sure, okay, you're online, you've got the world at your fingertips, but how do you sort through what is good information versus what is bad information? Because there's a lot of bad information on the internet.
And there's a lot of people out there who are like, well, um, you're not, you don't deserve to be trans because you found out too late. Too bad. And I had to sort through a lot of that. I had to sort through some stuff where it's like, yeah, sure, we'll do whatever you want to the detriment of everyone else around you, which I also had to avoid. Because it's all fine and good to get the medical treatment that you need, but if you can't afford it, then you know don't put your family at risk. So it fell somewhere in the middle for me because um you go and research, and at first what you do is you kind of do a social transition. You start trying out stuff online. Maybe you're like, okay, what if I am just a guy online? What if I try out this name online? And it started to feel right. I mean, for the longest time my name wasn't even Claude. It was like, I think it was Phaedronus, which is you know not it.
Is that PH?
Yeah, PH. Yeah.
There's actually play about an overwrought mother who kills her kid called
Oh,
Phaedra.
dear.
That's a French play.
That's
So
funny.
there you go. Um, let me throw out the classics for you, Phaedra. So um, within that same context, so you're sort of trying on these different identities, but you're also sort of hiding behind the internet.
Right.
When did it feel, I don't know if real is the right term, but when did you
More
know it was
concrete, maybe.
right? When did it feel like, boom, this is who I am, so that there was that sense of, get out of the way, world, here I come, which I get a sense
Yeah.
from you is there. So
Yeah. I talked to a lot of people about it. I talked to a lot of friends and family members. Um, I I think my husband was the first that I told, and all he said was, if that's who you are, that's great. Just don't move too fast for yourself, And I made sure not to. um, but some people didn't take it so great. But that I almost feel like it was more of like it felt to it felt to me like they were more defying what they had already seen rather than um just being like, oh no, you're just being silly. And the people who did support were like, oh yeah, that makes sense.
okay, so
So it was really based on reaction, I'd say.
okay, so let me gonna ask you, you mentioned your husband. So did you identify as poly or bi, or I mean,
So strangely enough, this is a comment that I made to. I have always been attracted to men.
okay.
Um, I've only just now found out that I am bi. But I've always been attracted to men, and I once said to somebody who is not a boy any longer, but I said to them, "Hey, if I was if I was a guy, I feel like I'd be gay." The things we say in high school.
And the reason why I ask you is because one of the right-wing talking points right now, actually coming from gay Trumplicans, believe it or not, is that if we allow people to continue to be transgender, then gay and lesbian people are going to disappear because they're all just going to become the opposite gender, and then they don't have to worry about homophobia. I mean, it's this very
Mm,
bizarre
yeah.
psychic construct that I'm like, dude, I think you need some counseling more than anything.
Yeah. Well, I
Um,
mean, that's the talking point that TERFs come to, I think, is that there's trans women and they're preying on women, which is stupid and wrong. But hey,
well, and we're going to get into some of that a
yeah.
little more in depth, because I think there's some stuff that we need to peel some layers back on in terms of
Hmm.
language, that ironically, when we talk about anti-trans language, it is almost exclusively targeted towards men who are transitioning to women.
Right.
Women who
Yep.
transition to men are like completely out of the conversation. There's no recognition.
Right.
And I think that in and of itself shows the contextualized sexism that's involved here. But we'll get at
Right.
that.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, the way that I liken it to, there's a lot of people out there who are not understanding what transgender means, even in the context of like, well, what's the difference between, couldn't you just be gay? And it's like, well, no, because, I explained it to my mom and I said, you're thinking about it in the terms of you're thinking, oh, well, I can't be a man. No, what happens is you are a woman, but nobody else around you sees you as a woman. Nobody treats you like a woman, but you're a woman. That's what being trans means. It's
that's
definitely a whole identity rather than, and I'm not saying that like sexual orientation isn't an identity, but it's an identity facet versus like a, a gender identity.
well, right. I mean, let's be honest. We are a gendered society. We have created a
Right.
very gendered reality, right? And it's a very binary reality. You're either a
Hmm.
boy or you're a girl, despite the fact
Right.
that science shows that there's a whole continuum of gender and gender expression. And there are real rules about how you're supposed to express yourself based on whatever gender you were assigned at birth.
Right.
And so our entire culture is built around that. So it will, I'll use myself as an example. I'm not trans, but I'll use myself as an example. I was assigned male at birth,
Right.
but if I were transgender, it wouldn't correspond, excuse me, it wouldn't correspond. My internal workings would not connect with that idea of masculinity and whatnot. I would be more contextualized to the female gender role, if you will. But it goes
Yes.
so much deeper than that because there's so many layers of psyche at play. Did you do some counseling, some professional counseling to get an
Oh,
official dysphoria?
yep.
Talk a little bit about that process, because I think one of the things that's come up in some of the discussions that I've had with folks is, there's this perception out there that somebody says tomorrow, oh, I'm trans, and they go to the doctor and the doctor just writes them prescriptions for hormones and off you go. And in 2 weeks, they're going to have the surgery and be completely reconstructed. And I'm like, that's
Right.
not how this works at
No.
all.
I think it took me 6 months to a year to get my hormones, and I'm still waiting for top surgery. So
Not everybody has top surgery or any of the surgery.
no, not everybody does, but I want it. And I have to wait for it,
Right.
Yep.
And is that based
but
on
yeah,
medical guidance or?
yeah, it's based on medical guidance.
Okay.
For sure. I'm also like, I also suffer from some mental illness, which is obviously unrelated to my transgender identity, but the hormones that I go on can make it worse. So I had to have special clearance. Like the intricacies of medically transitioning are just really well taken care of. I had to make sure that I wouldn't just be self-destructive when I went on the hormones.
And by self-destructive, let's suss that out a little bit more, because that could
Yeah.
be taken out of context, and I don't want that to happen.
I mean self-destructive as in like, yelling at people, pushing people away, being irritable, being more depressed, more anxious, etc.
Okay, because the testosterone would exacerbate the
Right.
underlying mental health issue.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
And that's what I was getting at, is trying to get that. And let's be honest, I'm a guy. I have natural testosterone. We can be pretty much assholes from
Sometimes,
the
yeah.
testosterone.
Sometimes we're the worst.
We really are. So I can see how injecting that into one's body for the first time, while also having depression and anxiety and that sort of stuff, could lead to some outbursts that were a little bit socially uncomfortable.
Right.
So tell me, this is weird, but it's important in terms of humanizing again.
Mm-hmm.
Tell me your favorite story about sharing with somebody that you were transgender, and then the worst story of coming out as transgender. Because I think, because there's that spectrum, right? I mean, you've got some family members that and friends and whatnot, they're like, woo, let's go get you on testosterone. But there are others who are like, God says, so let's try and capture that elemental.
Yeah, my favorite experience of coming out as trans was honestly when I share with people who don't know that I'm trans. They just think I'm just some queer little dude, and that's what one of my friends described me as before they got to know me. They were like, I knew something was up. But it's so fascinating to share the experiences and to see, oh, that's why that is, and just bring some clarity to the whole process, because when you're going about it alone, it's a little bit different than if you're trying to like figure out what does it look like for you, what does it look like for me, what's the same, what's different,
Right. So now for the uncomfortable part, and that's
right.
the worst experience.
I will say this, it ended in a screaming match.
Okay.
My dad is not a fan at all. And I asked him to use he, his pronouns for me. And he told me that I would not be a man until I had a penis, and maybe not even then.
Help my readers understand, I mean, that is a fundamental rejection of your child. I mean, at the
Right.
very core, help my readers understand what you felt in that moment. I mean, obviously a screaming match is one thing, but underlying that, as a theater person, I always look at, okay, anger is anger. And yeah, we can all run around the stage and scream and yell. But when you
Right.
put an underlying emotion such as hurt
Hmm.
underneath of it, that anger
Yeah,
suddenly becomes really dangerous.
exactly. Yeah, I was absolutely hurt and appalled. I was disgusted. I was obviously, grief stricken. Like I thought of all people he'd be excited, and to just have this ultimate rejection is just, it was so hurtful to me. I didn't start screaming obviously because that's not how we do things. But I was just like, I can't even believe you would say something like that, you know.
And he had, though, referred to you prior to transition as his eldest son, right?
Yep, he had.
That's got to be some really weird. But wait, wait. It, I mean, was that confusing? Was that
It was, yeah, because I was like, oh, you always wanted an eldest son. Here I am, and it's not it not only wasn't what he wanted, but it just, well, I'm not here to be who he wants, obviously, but
right?
it was like, I'm so confused. I can't just go back, man. That's not how this works.
Yeah, it's not a, oh wait, okay, just joking, which I
Right.
also think is one of those right-wing talking points that we're going to get at here briefly.
Hmm.
Um, have you and your dad found a common bridge since then, or is this
Sort of. His favorite thing to do to me is to basically not refer to me at all, which is to be like, hey you, which is honestly way better than misgendering. So, I'll take it.
well, it is better than misgendering. I wouldn't say it's way better, but
Oh, that's true. That's true.
it's certainly less offensive than misgendering. Let's
Right.
put it there. And also I think, you know, this is something that I had to learn as a gay man coming out, and that is that when we're born as children, and that assigned at birth gender is given to us, there are whole stories that we create for our children that when that child comes out as gay or trans now, we have to mourn the child that we thought we had before we can accept the child that we do have. And I think in a lot of ways, I hear that from parents of transgender children as well. So
Yes.
is that a fair assessment of sort of where your dad's at? He's on his own journey.
That is a very fair assessment, I would say. And I would say in that instance, and I realize that not everyone's looking for advice, but if you are a parent of a transgender kid, I'd say go ahead and get, some therapy, because everybody could use it, and it could help you work through feelings without pushing those on your kid.
Right. And oh, by the way, just go in therapy in general, because
Yeah,
American culture
absolutely.
has got all kinds of issues that we all need to talk about.
Yes, please go to therapy for sure.
Yeah, normalize therapy. Thank you.
Yes.
And Gaveston is sticking his head in, so he's
Yes.
back. Um, so that gives me a little bit of your backstory. Now I want to sort of talk a little bit about your front story, which
Mhm.
is sort of the political that's going on around us right now. I came of age as a gay man in the early 90s, the late 80s and early 90s. So that was the time that we were seeing petition drives to prohibit non-discrimination policies across the nation against gay people. I lived through the anti-marriage amendment stuff.
Mhm.
Ironically, I actually still don't care about marriage because we can still be fired for being queer.
Exactly.
So, there's some issues there. If you can get married on Sunday and get fired on Monday, there's a problem still.
Yes.
Because that marriage is not going to fundamentally save you so that you have food and housing, or medical care. So,
Right.
but unfortunately now it's the transgender community that's being really targeted and really quite nastily in a lot of the same ways that we've seen with gay men, again, in particular.
Hmm.
So as a trans man, I want you to help me help my readers unpack the inherent sexism of a lot of these attacks, because they are directed towards men who are transitioning to women.
Yep, they sure are.
What does that feel like for you when you're hearing these attacks? And they're saying all transgender, but they're really creating
Yeah.
a sexualized context. Help folks understand that. Talk a little bit about that.
Like, to be honest, it's terrifying, but nothing I feel could compare to the way that, my trans feminine and non-binary friends feel, who are more femme leaning or, femme adjacent. And the fact that, like, I've expounded on this somewhere, I don't remember where, but people really just don't want boys to do girly things. And I feel like the idea of trans women to them is just so repulsive, because it's this fear of, oh my God, what if my boy does a feminine thing? And it's sexism is what it is, because women are seen as these lesser beings. So to a lesser extent, that's some of the facing that I get, where it's like, oh well, you don't actually want to be a man, you're just tired of being, you know sat upon as a woman. I'm like, no. But you know it is definitely this idea of like, oh no, 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 don't do that, because what if my boy gets the idea, or what if I, as a man, get the idea to do it? What would that mean for me? you know
So, one of the things that we've seen is, in Texas, the order from Governor Abbott to start child abuse investigations on parents who are working with physicians and clinicians with their children to work on transitioning, whatever that transition may look like.
hmm
Does that scare you in any way? I mean,
Yeah, it does. Because how soon, if we don't stand up for our own, how soon till they come for us? Because I have a son, and there have been many people who are like, well, you're actually abusing him because you're trans and you're just being weird in the house and it's a sexual thing. And it's like, no, 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 no. That's not how this works. And also stop threatening my son. He's perfectly happy where he is. Thank you very much. Um, you know, and the children who are being threatened by this, it's so terrifying to just, I mean, there's a post from one kid who is going to school in, I believe, Florida, and they're not able to talk to their counselor because they can be outed to their parents, and then their parents talked about disowning them. So they're like, what do I do? Where do I go?
um, so speaking of Florida, the great state of Florida, which I will not be visiting anytime in the near future.
Nope, me neither.
Not only do they have the Don't Say Gay bill, but they've also their Department of Health actually put out a health advisory today,
Mm.
countering the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services guidance for care for transgender people. And all of their citations are for like the Catholic Medical Association or the American Academy of Pediatricians, which is the right-wing
Mhm.
anti-gay pediatricians group. At what point does this kind of politicalization of medicine impact not just you as a transgender person,
Right.
anybody's health care? Is that
I think it already is. I know a woman who tried to have breast reduction surgery because they're big and they hurt her back, and she had to go through a whole hell of a lot just to get them reduced. Like, and that's a cis woman, to her knowledge.
right?
Um, like, it's already impacting us. Like anything that's like, hey, I would like to um, better my, better my body for my health. There's gonna be a big fight. There's already a big fight.
And again, it revolves around controlling women's bodies.
It does. It does.
I guess, one of the constructs that I'm trying to understand is, we know that a great many of transgender folks will never get affirmative surgery because of
Right.
cost, because it's not necessarily as effective as we would like it to be in terms of matching our full identity.
Hmm.
What is your, right, the dogs are doing something, and I'm like, oh, what do you do now? What is your take on that? I mean, are we creating a culture of fear? Is this a 1950s Red Scare thing, except now it's the tranny,
Yeah,
the slur use
I
there,
know.
but I'm trying to make fun of the 50s movie titles.
Right. Yeah. No, it absolutely is. It absolutely is. I saw something, a piece of news come out that they're trying to prohibit social transition now,
Mhm.
which it's just like, at what point do we kick back? Because you've got boys who want to wear pink or dresses. You've got girls who want to, put on jeans and sneakers. Not that those are inherently, you know what I'm going for here.
Right, right. I mean,
Yeah.
so here's an irony. I did Rocky Horror Show for years. I wore my tights and my, my my fishnets and my corset. I had no problem going out in public like that. I am very much cis. But I didn't, it was like, it's clothing. What does it matter?
Right.
I mean,
Right.
what's the
Exactly.
difference? If I put on a dress or if I put on pants, what is the difference other than the gendered expectation that you've laid on top of it?
Right. It scares people, quite frankly.
That's because we're changing the gender rules.
Right. Exactly. And it's just a fear of change, I think.
So in that same context, we do have people who are well-meaning, but are really confused about the idea of young children transitioning. Again, it goes back to that perception that, the 5-year-old says, the 5-year-old boy says, I'm really a girl. And mom and dad say, okay, let's start you on hormones and puberty blockers. And it's just not that way. But how do we have that conversation? Because it's a nuanced conversation.
It is. And I think that this is something, I'm an advocate for like age appropriate sex education. At 4 or 5, my son knew the names for his genitals, and he knew if they were ever touched by someone who is not a doctor or his parents, that he needs to get help, from someone he trusts. That's what it looks like. He learned at 6 or 7 when those thoughts would start forming. What would it mean if he were? He decided he wasn't. I left it at that. He can decide again if he chooses or not. I don't really care. It's not my, he's not me, he's
Well,
not my property.
and I want to be clear that gender identity is not a choice.
Right, exactly.
There's actually a whole lot of science that actually shows that there's a lot of brain influence involved here that is differentiated, that, again, because we're so focused on men transitioning to women, most of those studies have been on M to F.
Right.
What they see is in brain scans, the female trans folks actually have the brain structure and activity of a biological female,
Yep.
designed at birth female.
And that's why those thoughts form so young too.
Because it is
Because,
truly the
yeah.
structural identity of the person.
Right, exactly.
So I just wanted to make sure we corrected that, because sometimes I think we understand that when we say choosing, what we're really saying is
Choosing to come out.
I've owned it and I'm being public about it, versus oh, hey, today I'm going to be this gender.
Right, exactly.
And those are two very different realities. So within that context, so you've got a son he's what, 7, you said?
8. Yep.
Okay. Have you had any issues with school officials with your transition, with you saying, hey, I want to be use he, him?
There was a little bit of messiness in the beginning because I've been on hormones for about 3 or 4 years, so I didn't look like a man in the beginning,
Okay.
you know. So they would be like, "Is that Aster's mom?" And I'm like, "No, no, it's not. Nice try."
No, I'm
But
his dad.
the teachers were really good about it. I'm lucky that he goes to such a nice school.
Okay.
He's lucky that he goes to such a nice school.
What, I don't want to identify the school, but the district.
No,
What district are you guys in?
Lansing, surprisingly.
Lansing Public Schools. Okay,
Yep,
good.
yep.
Excellent. So what do you think about Lana Tice's fundraising email where she's accusing transgender people of sexualizing children?
I think that's evil because there's two camps. There's, trans people who work with children, and then there's trans children. And by grouping everyone, and I'm just going to say that no trans person is going to sexualize a child. That's not why they're transitioning. But by grouping predators in with trans people, it's insulting and quite frankly violent to these two groups that I just mentioned.
And we do see the violence against the trans community significantly higher than we see it against the LGBT community right now. I mean, it used to be the transgender community would be lumped into just sexual orientation violence. And now we've begun separating the trans community out, and we see that there's a dramatic increase in violence against the community.
Hmm.
So do you feel safe when you're out on the street? I mean, you're living in what we would call a same-sex relationship.
Yeah.
But do you feel safe when you walk around in Lansing and with your husband and your child? And
It really depends where we go because there's some people who are going to be a little weird about it. There's people who are going to be a little violent about it, and then there's people who are going to be fine with it. And it just really depends. You gotta like there's signs, it's definitely like coding, like if you see a house with a bunch of like Trump flags in it, probably avoid that house.
okay.
But if you see like, another rainbow flag on the neighborhood, I think that's another really good way of like saying, hey, we're here, we're together.
So in a perfect world, and we don't live in one, so let's just clarify that. But in a perfect world, how would we as a society be having discussions about the transgender community? I mean, I would hope with not just with, but I'm sorry, let me reframe that. Not about the community, but
Right.
with the community.
With
But
the
right now
community.
it's happening about the community. So in a
Right.
perfect world, what would the conversation with like Alana Tice be like for you?
Well, I would think that you know, um there's a lot of like gain to receive from having speakers who are from different walks rather than just we're against this. Well, what if you pull somebody from that group, just like how we have authors and different public speakers in schools, in auditoriums, for people to come listen to and learn from and have dialogues with. There's forums, like public forums, like not so much these days because of COVID, but you know what I mean, like
Right.
discussions, like coffee shop meetings, etc. I think that would be the best way to go about it.
So how do we as a newspaper, because the media is in some ways, I mean, I think I like to believe that the City Pulse is a little bit more progressive and
Right.
a little less likely to promote the anti-trans diatribes out there. But we are going to, I am going to have somebody who is known for suing school districts over transgender equity policies
Mhm.
in this story. So how do we as media do a better job of countering the Lana Tice's, the Marjorie Taylor Greens, the Governor Abbott's, the Ron DeSantis's in America?
Well, I think what you've done here is a really big step already. Is by taking the perspectives of trans folks, and just really going into depth with it. And then, when you go into depth into these people's arguments, why do you think this way? Why are you saying this? Can you back that up? It'll come really clear really fast. Who's in the right.
And I guess I want to challenge the idea of somebody being right or wrong,
That's true. That's
because
true.
that gives people permission to say that your identity is wrong.
That's true. And I don't really like that. I don't think that's a good idea. And I mean good as in like smart or logical,
Right.
rather than, you know,
And
but
go ahead.
oh, sorry. I mean, at some point, there are people who you can't really have like a discussion with, obviously. But when it comes to, discussing with anti-trans people, I think really the thing to go for here is like, well, why is it that you think you have a right to live your life, but these other people don't have a right to live their life? Why is there this inequality here? Because inequality at its core is not logical.
Right. Well, and we do run into a lot of folks who oppose people being transgender because of their religious belief system. And it becomes really difficult, I think, sometimes to have conversations within that context, because in their mind, uh, honoring you and your identity and whatnot is a sin and will send them to hell. And I'm certainly a person of faith. I have a deep spirituality, but I also have some sympathy, I think, for the person who really, truly, deeply believes that they're going to go to this horrible place forever if they break these rules. Is that a group that we can reach?
I feel like it is because, that's honestly a group where I came out of, being super uber religious. And well, here I am. But also, there's a lot of counterpoints to that. Jesus welcomed all. Um, and if you're a Christian and you follow Christ, why is it that, you say sin's okay in the one place, but over here it's not? Like, wouldn't it be more important to really honor people over whatever it is that you think is a bad idea that you're doing anyway because you want to?
Right. So one other thing that I'm going to sort of toss out there, because it's out in the ether, the Child and Family Services, which is one of the largest providers for child psychological services and support services, etc., was looking at purchasing St. Casimir's Church. And that actually fell apart in part because the Catholic Church is now requiring the sale of their properties to have deed restriction in perpetuity, prohibiting any sort of affirmative support for transgender people.
Now that's interesting, and I'll tell you why. I used to go to St. Cat's.
Okay.
They did not shut down because it was their time. They shut down because the father there was somebody who spoke in support of people like me, people who are shunned by the church. He was one of the types of people who said Jesus welcomed all, and they shut down the church because of that.
I'm gonna have to look into that, because that's a piece of information I didn't have. But they have signed a lease to own agreement with a basketball organization, which is actually a really great basketball program. That's called AIM, I think is its name. And I talked to the owner of the guy who runs the program, and he said, I don't care what a kid's gender identity is. I care if they want to play basketball.
That's exactly the way to be. I love that.
And the response back from the Catholic Church is, well, we're not sure we're going to be able to do a sale then, because that's affirming the gender identity of transgender people. And that would violate that deed restriction. And I'm not sure that deed restriction is necessarily legal.
I don't think it is.
But it's certainly an interesting question.
Yeah.
Do you think that, we saw a lot of the same pushback against the gay community, if we give, job protections to gay people or public accommodations protections, gay men are going to come in and molest our little boys in the bathroom. That was an argument in the 80s and 90s. It really was.
I know, because I see it now.
And even before that was also an argument against desegregation.
Mm-hmm.
If we desegregate our bathrooms, then the black men are going to rape our white women. Honestly, so bathrooms have been a constant fixation for bias. I almost said bigotry because that's really what it is, but I'm going to be as
I get it,
non-judgmental as I can be. Do you feel like in 20 years the trans community will be where the gay community is at? Because that's really, I look at this in frame, it really wasn't until the late 80s and early 90s that the gay community suddenly just sort of took off in winning support from political support. And since then, we've seen just a huge outgrowth of support. Do you think in 20 years, the trans community is going to be the same way and we won't be having these arguments anymore?
I would love for that to be the case, but I honestly can't sit here and say that I think it will.
Okay. And do you think that that's because we're fundamentally having a conversation, whether we're cognizant of it or not, about rigid gender roles in American culture? And
I think that's definitely a big part of it. Yeah.
Okay. So how do we talk about this in a way where we are deliberately pointing out to people, look, this is a conversation about gender constructs, which, oh, by the way, cause you harm as well.
Yes. That's the big important thing that I think a lot of people miss when they say that they're against things like transgender identity and, teaching about gender and etc. Is that gender constructs like that are also impacting them. They're the reason that men don't feel like they can go to therapy, and commit suicide at a higher rate. That's the reason. That's it.
Right. So how do we give people?
I'm sorry, I'm stalling.
That's okay. That's okay. I mean, I don't have an answer for it. I mean, if I had an answer for it, I'd probably be really rich.
Right. Yeah.
I'd be Oprah. No, she looks much better than I do. Maybe Dr. Phil.
Right.
Without the anti-trans attitude.
Yeah.
So is it fair to acknowledge, though, from the trans community, that some of the concerns that are being raised by people like David Coleman, this lawyer that I'm going to talk to, are not necessarily inappropriate concerns to raise? I mean, the idea of having a conversation, in some ways, people believe that when we read Heather Has Two Mommies to a second grade class, that's some way sexualizing them.
Right. And that's really sad to me, because there are kids who have two mommies, and what are they gonna, if they don't have an idea of somebody else out there who's got their experiences, they're not really gonna, they're gonna be like really unhappy about it, and that's just sad.
So but how do we?
Right.
I mean,
I think,
go ahead.
Sorry, I think that the way to kind of talk about, like, I think you do have to, like, ask the questions, when they're like, well, and come at them honestly, because that's how you change minds. Is you don't just kind of ignore people. Like, I mean, it's as like a civilian, it's not really my job to like be like, oh well, you're wrong because you know. But
Right.
if somebody comes up to me and has an honest question like, hey, you know, how did you know you were trans? Or like, hey, how easy is it actually to get the medicine? You know, that's and just to come at it honestly and be like, okay, here's what's going on. Because I again, I came from a place where it's like, you know, it's I came from a Republican family, and you know, they're not really the keenest on, you know, looking at things objectively and being like, oh well, I guess you're right about that. They're not really very good at that. I'm going to be honest.
I think all of us have a lens that we look at the world through.
Right.
Um, so I think I guess I'm going to challenge a little bit on that. You're asking people to ask questions in ways that they're actually informed by. You know what I'm saying? To have somebody ask the question of, so how did you have to go about getting testosterone, is a much more logical question and much more informed question than I think most people are at.
Right. And
So do we
I
need to
think a lot of
listen?
it comes down to education.
Right.
Like maybe
Go ahead.
sorry, like there's a lot of like community centers and libraries out there who have some really good classes on things like computer literacy, how to find a job. I think that there's a room for a lot of different like social types of classes like this, for people who didn't grow up in environments where they might not have learned as much. I think that's a really good thing to really like push and be like, hey, you can learn a lot more in this type of class than you could just out doing your thing, you know?
Right. Do you think though that we have an obligation to hear not necessarily the question that's being asked,
Right.
but what the real question is that they're trying to get at, that they're not even aware that they're asking it?
Right. Yeah, you're saying, you know, is it fair to address something that is not respectfully toned, but is, you know, has got the question underneath, right?
Right.
Right. Yeah, it really depends on the person.
Right.
Um, yeah, it does. Because like I would say it is fair, but you know, if you are constantly faced with these types of questions, it might be okay to be like, okay, hey, you know, I got to take a break, you know?
And that's self-care. I mean, that's for
Yeah,
all of us who may
exactly,
be in a
exactly.
minority group. And so within that construct as well, um, I guess the last question I would put to you, and then I have one other that is my actual last question, but it's my favorite,
Okay.
is what advice would you give to somebody who is a teenager who is coming to terms with their gender identity, in a hostile environment, like let's say Langsburg or
Right.
Waverly schools, or even
Right.
in the Lansing schools? It may feel a lot less safe than what you have currently experienced.
Right.
So what advice do
And
you have for the next generation?
right. It is definitely hard to say. I would say, you know, really just um a lot of teens like to do this where it's like, hey, I'd like to ask this about a friend. And you just make up that hypothetical friend, but don't get too close. Because then, you know, the cat's out of the bag. But that's a good tactic, I feel like, because you have to build up a network, but you have to build up a network that's like safe, you know. There's always going to be there's always going to be people who are supportive in a hostile environment because you can't really just move, you know,
Right.
up and move. Maybe that's where their family grew up. Maybe they just don't have enough money, you know, but they're still there. Or maybe they're there on purpose to help, you know, teens like that.
Okay. So this is my last question that I ask everybody in every interview that I do. And it's my favorite. And that is,
Okay.
is there anything that I didn't ask you that you think is really important for readers of City Pulse on this particular topic,
On this particular topic, let's see.
which is a really broad topic, by the way?
It is a really broad topic. Um, I really, really, really like the brain conversation that we went into. I would implore people to look more into that because it's true, you know.
All right. All right. I'm going to turn off the
Okay.
recording. Hold on just 1 second.